It is a truth universally acknowledged that every left-wing YouTuber must at some point make a video about Harry Potter. It looks like this is going to be mine. In 2016, the documentary maker Adam Curtis released Hypernormalization, a documentary that you can get on BBC iPlayer that argues that the global economic crises of the 1970s led to a group of governments and financiers developing a fake world for the rest of us to live in that was obscuring the complicated real world, and that it allowed those neoliberal governments to cement their position and retain power. He starts by saying that this term hypernormalization came from a Russian anthropologist. As I was watching this documentary, I stopped and I thought, what Russian anthropologist? You can't mention a Russian anthropologist to me, a person who is an anthropologist and hyperfixated on Russian culture from Victorian through to the fall of the Soviet Union. You can't do that. No, I need to know who this person is. So I did the thing that we all do if we're academic. I went straight to my university library search system and I looked up, who is this Russian guy? I looked up the term hypernormalization and Russian anthropologist, and I came up with the book by Alexei Yurchak called Everything Was Forever Until It Was No More. It's a study of the last generation of people who grew up under Russian communism and who had to deal with and process the collapse of their civilization, their whole state, at the end of the 1980s. What we saw from the West, if you're watching this as a Westerner and you were alive at the time, as I was, the Berlin Wall is seen as this watershed moment when it was torn down, but actually that was the result of a long and complex struggle in the Eastern Bloc over how to be and how to live in the world. Now, my focus here is not really to go through that book in intense detail, but to discuss in particular how Yurchak focuses on how crucial fiction and reading were to Russians who were living through perestroika and glasnost and were facing the fact that their whole world and their reality was starting to collapse. I need to start by explaining what hypernormalization means. It refers to the way that states attempt to create this persistent legitimacy when reality is pulling further and further apart from that. The best way to explain hypernormalization is to use an example from the West, and I'm going to use Elon Musk's Nazi salute for that. Now, it is a Nazi salute. Everyone can see that it's a Nazi salute. And honestly, you'd have to have been living under a rock on another planet for the last 85 years not to immediately make that connection. Yet mainstream media and the government itself downplayed it. To pick a UK example, the BBC referred to it as an arm gesture, oh my God, and later received complaints for its inability to fully acknowledge the way that they'd handled this. Now, we've known for 80 years what this salute was about. The idea that it relates to Roman salutes has been debunked by the relevant historians. This is hypernormalization in practice. It's an attempt by the state and media organizations and anyone who has a vested interest in the status quo and the 1914 film Kabiria. Interestingly, is hypernormalization in practice. It's an attempt by the state and media organizations and anyone who has a vested interest in the status quo to attempt to dictate what something means when we see it and proclaim that it is something other than what it is when it might challenge their authority. Now, Yurchak goes on to discuss how in order to present this legitimacy, the state has to ensure that its legitimacy sat outside ideological arguments. He presents what he calls the Claude Lefort paradox, which is that ideology has to be presented as non-ideological. We see this being recreated now in the way that the right especially presents arguments as being ideological and that their view of the world is concrete reality. This is especially true and visceral in, for example, trans rights discussions, where the right frames this as trans or gender ideology, as if that label can instantly delegitimize any of those arguments. So Yurchak argues, in other words, to fulfill its political function of reproducing power, the ideological discourse must claim to represent an objective truth that exists outside of it. However, the external nature of this objective truth renders the ideological discourse inherently lacking in the means to describe it in total, which can ultimately undermine this discourse's legitimacy and the power that it supports. This inherent contradiction of any version of modern ideology, argues Lefort, can be concealed only by the figure of the master, who, by being presented as standing outside ideological discourse and possessing external knowledge of the objective truth, temporarily conceals the contradiction by allowing it to appear through himself. And we see this reproduced in very right-wing speakers, and Farage has attempted to do it, Trump obviously attempts to do it. This attempt to claim objective truth and to use the term ideology to frame anything that contradicts that. Now, there is a whole argument we could have around that particular area, but what I want to do in this video is focus in particularly on the role of fiction in all that, because I'm a reader, I'm a writer, this channel is all about books, and what I really wanted to do is discuss how fiction is and was absolutely critical to how we, on the everyday level, deal with what we're facing now, which is very similar to what the Russians faced in the 1980s. I'm going to start in what is going to seem like a weird place. Harry Potter. There are a great many videos on YouTube now that have dissected Harry Potter from various different viewpoints. We have many that I will link down below in the comments. We have discussions of its ableism, its fat phobia, the way that it treats minority groups, for example. We have Lily Simpson's absolutely brilliant 10-hour dissection of every aspect of the Harry Potter universe. Plus, now a sequel to that, which deals specifically with Hogwarts Legacy. And I do feel that we ought to make it a rule on YouTube that every time we mention J.K. Rowling, we have to mention a trans creator. So that's me obeying that particular rule. Obviously, there are a lot of videos that are doing very similar things, but I want to highlight Sean's video because he discusses how J.K. Rowling's neoliberal politics informed her fiction and the world she invented, because it's highly relevant for understanding how we are expected to conceive of reality through fiction now, and how the idea that this is a system that cannot be challenged has been reproduced in the fiction of the 2000s. Harry Potter absolutely dominated, and its role cannot be underestimated in how we imagine we can construct change in a system, or whether that system needs to be taken apart altogether. Sean presents three major points that are worth considering. Firstly, J.K. Rowling constructs a hierarchy where the problem is not systemic, but based on the individual in any particular position. This thesis isn't about the system that is the problem, but the individual and their actions. This makes it impossible to confront systemic change. All you are supposed to do in the Harry Potter universe is to swap out the bad person for the good person. Secondly, people are fundamentally good or bad, and this is not contingent on their actions. Good characters do the same thing as bad characters, and it's okay for those good characters because they are good. It is bad that Dursley bullies Harry, but good characters, for example the Weasley twins, bully Dursley for being fat, even though, as far as we can tell, they don't know what he's like as a person other than he eats a lot of food, so they bully him. Thirdly, as a result of this, no character attempts to change the political system under which they live. Everything operates at the level of the individual. So Harry can free Dobby from slavery, but he can't end the enslavement of the house elves, And when Hermione attempts to do this, it is treated as comic relief and as fundamentally silly. This sits in tension with the simultaneous idea that people can be reduced to stereotypes, which removes individual agency and response at the same time as suggesting that the only possible solution to problems lies in good people replacing bad people in an unchanging system. Dobby, as an individual, can want to be freed, but house elves as a group cannot be freed because their natural state is enslavement, and that is what they prefer. And why am I talking about all of this? Well, Harry Potter dominated the Western world of children's fiction in the 2000s, and this idea of a permanent, unchanging system that lasts forever, where all you do to bring about any change is swap out bad guys for good guys and it's all fine, is what people have been raised with. We fundamentally have no underlying central imaginary concept of completely changing the system. I mean, you also got SpongeBob SquarePants, and I'm super envious of that. In a weird way, that's also kind of a fundamental part of the sense of who we are, is SpongeBob working a basic job and struggling with reality versus a magical system where certain people get all the magical power in order to over others, feels kind of on point for the system that we're living in right now. I will just highlight that obviously there has been a great rise in dystopian fiction, and that concurrent with Harry Potter, young adult fiction was centered on the idea of challenging dystopian systems. And yet again, what we see particularly in the Hunger Games is the system simply reproducing itself, and it ends very badly with a new dictator, a new person coming in who is potentially just as bad as the old one. The system remains, it cannot be changed. This is a problem for us. Back in the 1970s and 1980s Russia, fiction was also crucial. There had been a long-standing project on the western side and the eastern side of people trying to get fiction that had been banned into Russia. This is incidentally why banning books becomes so important in systems when they are trying to perpetuate themselves at a point where the majority of people have been thoroughly disenfranchised from them. Now, while we have been struggling to comprehend and deal with the situation and have this core of fiction that has become so popular that sees the system as being entirely unending and permanent, in Russia, they were dealing with the tension of this system is about to collapse, and yet it is also forever. So in the 1970s and 1980s, fiction became utterly critical for people learning to understand and work with a system that was falling apart. And it enabled them to imagine something new and something different. Yurchak begins his book, Everything Was Forever Until It Was No More, by describing the experiences of many of the people in Russia who were living with this system, by describing the experiences of people who were attempting to negotiate a changing reality as the forces of glasnost took hold. And now at first he says that the campaigns were thought to be no different from the endless state-orchestrated media campaigns before them, campaigns that came and went while life went on as usual. However, within a year or two, the realization that something unimaginable was taking place began to dawn on the Soviet people. Many speak of having experienced a sudden break of consciousness and stunning shock, quickly followed by excitement and ready to participate in the transformation. Although different people experience that moment differently, the type of experience they describe is similar, and many remember it vividly. Here we have a section from Everything Was Forever Until It Was No More. Tonya, a school teacher born in Leningrad in 1966, describes the moment she first realised around 1987 that something impossible was taking place. I was reading on the metro and suddenly experienced utter shock. I remember that moment very well. I was reading Lev Razgon's story, Uninvented, just published in Uenost. I could never have imagined that anything even remotely comparable would be published. After that, the stream of publications became overwhelming. And it is interesting to realise that what they saw as being surprising was not so much the story itself and its contents. This wasn't surprising to them because they were living what was being described every single day. It was the fact that the state was slowly beginning to recognise it. This boom in literary interest in late 1980s Russia absolutely blew up after this point. Alexei Yurchak describes how often it was impossible to find many of the more popular publications at newsstands because of the speed with which they sold out. In letters to the weekly magazine Ogonyak, readers complained of having to stand in line at the local kiosk at 5 a.m, 2 hours before it opened, to have any chance of buying the magazine. I mean, as an author writing now, and if you were attempting to get published, you will probably be absolutely stunned that there were so many people wanting to read fiction and to read short stories. But this was their primary mode of engaging with a world where change was conceived as being possible. Tonya describes how my friend Katya and I started subscribing to monthly literary journals. Everyone tried to subscribe to different journals so they could exchange them with friends to have access to more materials. Everyone around us was doing this. I spent the whole year incessantly reading these publications. And what Yurchak is suggesting is that as a result of this process, in the late 1980s, there was a widespread realization that the state socialism, which had seemed so eternal, might in fact be coming to an end. Italian literary scholar Vittorio Strada, who spent much time in the Soviet Union before the transformation began, summarized the experience of the fast-forwarded history that he encountered among the Soviet people in the late 1980s. No one, or almost no one, could imagine that the collapse would happen so soon and so fast. The timing of the end and the way in which it occurred was simply startling. Now, we have a slightly complicated situation here because I do want to argue that fiction can both uphold a system that is seen as inevitable and unchanging in the way that J.K. Rowling's fiction does, or it can challenge those narratives. And a great deal of our dystopian fiction and our fiction now is attempting to deconstruct those narratives. That's when fiction seeks to make visible people who are being erased from the system and our society. It becomes even more important to see them. He highlights in his first chapter that he wants to deconstruct and move away from Western perceptions of people living under communism as either complicit dupes or, evil actors as part of a terrifying regime. That they were just the same as people living in the West. They were driven by complex individual but also group structures and drives, and that they wanted to create a new society. They wanted to have this opportunity to dream and to live a newer, better life. So their concept of the West was potentially as flawed and as tricky to understand as ours was of the East. My main issue is that they had something to walk towards. What happened in November 1989 when the Berlin Wall fell was the end result of a very long process of change and transformation and pressure and people resisting state forces. They could see something to move towards. Our difficulty is that we do not have something concrete that exists in current reality that provides us with an alternative that we can walk towards. We have to move beyond the idea that you can simply swap out bad people and good people to achieve the same result in a system that has become so fundamentally corrupted and so fundamentally supportive of only a minority versus a majority. The recent video by How Money Works a couple of weeks ago, which examined how unimportant we have become as people in an economic system that is increasingly built for the super rich, even down to the question of if we have no money, who buys all the stuff, becomes irrelevant because there are super rich people to buy all of the stuff. And we do not matter in an economic sense at all. This is very dark and very depressing stuff. Now, fiction had always been used to challenge the system in Russia. Russia actually had a long history of protest and fiction that was critical of the state. The state had done a great deal to ban those books, to prevent access to those books. We see this situation being reproduced in the West now, particularly in the US, and book bannings. And that is something that we must at all points fight against, because the end result does not look good. It's not as though writers showed up and began writing this material new and fresh. It was that readers now had the opportunity to read it and really bridge the gap between the world that they were being told was true and the world they were actually living in. Solzhenitsyn is possibly the most well-known of these authors. Cancer Ward, which won the Nobel Prize, carefully unpicks what life was like in Soviet Russia at mid-century. And obviously, A Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich illustrates the experience of living in a gulag, which is something that the West has kind of canonized as part of the Russian experience. Solzhenitsyn's skill is making powerful political points while focusing entirely on individual humans living out their daily lives, with the regular issues that humans face in dealing with each other. The romantic tensions of Cancer Ward especially highlight how human life goes on in regular ways, even when you're faced with a huge personal health crisis like cancer. He does also include a moment where he discusses how the state used fiction that supported the narratives in order to perpetuate the state within regular people's imagination, and that is certainly where Harry Potter appears to sit. There's also science fiction, which sought to challenge the narratives that were being perpetuated by the state. So we have Yevgeny Zamyatin's We, which is especially thrilling to me because I also have synesthesia and it can be hard to read because he sees letters and numbers in different colours to me. That was written in the early 20th century. And then we have Bulgakov's Master and Margarita that I read for the first time a few years ago, was subject to severe editing and initial banning in order to prevent people challenging the state and its orthodoxy. Now, as you can see, there's a pattern here. The Strugatsky brothers' Roadside Picnic is also worth mentioning. Ursula K. Le Guin, who absolutely haunts this channel, and she's mentioned in my Moomin video and another one I've got coming up about The Expanse, notes in the introduction to the Masterworks edition that the Strugatsky brothers wrote as free men, refusing to bow to ideological pressures one way or the other. So this is really why fiction presents us with an opportunity to challenge the narratives of the state. This is why it is so critical for us to fight book bannings, to push back against states that mandate the disappearance of particular groups of people especially. It's why representation matters more now than ever before. Stories are fundamentally how we process living in the world as human beings. This is raised by the creative writing professor Lisa Cron in a number of her works, as well as Will Storr in his books on how to write. As an author, you're able to connect with the reader using the basic hooks that we need to drive a story, to think about who we are in the world, but also to think about how systems function. We use stories to understand who we are and what's happening to us, and it can happen in the most unexpected novels. One of my favourites is A Short History of Tractors in Ukrainian, and it really helped me at a critical moment in thinking about my relationship with my parents, for example. But all of these are intended to challenge a narrative coming down from the top. What we appear to be seeing right now is an increasing pressure by state systems to determine what fictional realities we can or are allowed to imagine. This is why I want to highlight the work of Reads with Rachel right now, because she has been instrumental in leading the charge against book bannings in Florida, in her local county. There is value in escapism in fiction that doesn't obviously appear to engage with what's happening politically at all. We all have to be able to take a break from reality, especially this particular reality. In my video on Moomin Mama's Handbag, I shared that the inspiration and driving force behind Tove Jansson's writing in the first Moomin book, published 80 years ago in 1945, was that she felt that her art just didn't have any meaning in such a dark and terrible time. The Moomins may seem like innocent escapism, but all the novels are ways of engaging with difficult emotions and struggles. Moomin Valley in November deals with loneliness and isolation. The Great Flood deals with the refugee experience of trying to find a home when you have been displaced, something that has been faced by millions, especially on the Eastern Front. And that is not even to get into what was happening in China, India and Pakistan at the time. This is why you should never say that children's and young adult fiction gets a pass and should have a lower standard, because this is the fiction that helps children growing up to understand the world that they're living in, what they can challenge, what they can't challenge, and how to deal with systems when they go wrong. So this is also a plea to writers to keep writing. Now, to end, Yurchak argues that his book intended to show the realities of actually existing socialism, where control, coercion, alienation, fear, and moral quandaries were irreducibly mixed with ideals, communal ethics, dignity, creativity, and care for the future. I think that this is something that we have to remember in the most difficult times, that it is our ability to use our imaginations, even when we don't feel like we have an alternative system, to keep pushing back against the system that we do have and start to reconfigure it for some kind of positive change that actually benefits us all. So I will end there and say thank you very much for watching this. I hope that if you are a reader, you keep on reading. If you are a writer, please keep on writing. Keep on writing challenging narratives that encourage us to think about how we can deconstruct the systems that we live under. I have a Patreon, and I want to thank my Patreons for supporting me. You help me get my work done. I will figure out a way to make the levels work in the future so that we have live streams, lectures, exclusives coming up. So in particular, I want to thank my paid members, that is Matt Harwood, Gil the Gilded Dragon, Cameron Desar, Karen Kunda, Kay Channon, Jane Steele, Marley Marker, Jo Van Every, Rosie Griffith, and Jenny Ryan. Thank you ever so much for your continuing support. If you want to go check that out, you can see that I also put on 3 free things when I possibly can. You get videos at least 3 or 4 days earlier than they come out on YouTube. Otherwise, I hope to see you again in the next video, or you can go and watch some of my others. Thank you very much.